Every day I hear this China will break thing. Yeah, we're going to break it down today. Let's actually jump into that. The news headlines in the Western mainstream media are once again filled with the claim that China is going to collapse. Now, the last time we talked about this, we broke down Joe Rogan's conversation with Peter Zeihan, somebody who's been saying that China is going to collapse for at least 10 years now. He was even claiming China was going to collapse in the early 2000s. But of course, China didn't collapse. There was a book written in 2001 called The Inevitable Collapse of China or something, The Oncoming Collapse of China. Western academics have been doing wishful thinking in the form of scholarship, for a long time. Or maybe not Western academics, but the Western mainstream media has been saying that China's going to collapse soon. Soon. It's inevitable. It's coming. Trust us. China doesn't know what they're doing. Their socialist economy is soon to dissolve. It's going to collapse in on itself. It's going to go away just like the Soviet Union did, and Western multinationals will once again be able to pillage China for all they're worth. This is what the Western media keeps saying, but again, it's just them putting their wishful thinking out into the world and calling it news. So today we've got an article from the great economist and journalist John Ross, or I don't know if he considers himself a journalist, but great economist who does really good reports about the DPRK, about China and other countries in Asia and Southern Asia, who published an article for Midwestern Marx titled "The News is Full of Headlines About China's Economic Collapse. Ignore Them" by John Ross. So I recommend everybody read this if you get a chance. I'll copy and paste it in the chat right now. It's great to read the whole thing. It's very quick, just filled with economic data and, refuting a few of the claims from the Western media. But somebody also sent me this in the Discord the other day. This is from ABC News, I believe. China miscounted its population. Now the economy is in crisis. Another article or news story from the mainstream Western media. I believe this guy's based in Australia, claiming that China is going to collapse. So I figured we go through this, analyze his claims, look at them critically, and compare them to the data that John Ross brings up in his article, claiming that China's not going to collapse. So I believe this is like an Australian hipster Kyle Kulinski here. So let's see what Kyle has to say about China.
At 3:25 p.m. on August 27th, 2021, thousands of people in the Chinese city of Kunming were standing on their balconies or in streets and parks holding their cameras. Everyone was extremely excited. As 3:30 got closer, the tension built. How loud would it be? Would they all fall?
Sorry, Chesney6490, isn't China state capitalist? Ignore my dumbass if you've covered it. No worries. I mean, this is a question that everybody in the Western world has about China. Every socialist has about China. When we begin to talk about them, I would direct you to our video, Is China Marxist? Which is a video where I respond to Vijay Prashad, an Indian academic, talking about China, why China is socialist. I mean, I don't think state capitalist is a bad definition, but, in the tradition of Marxism-Leninism, Lenin wrote that in the transitionary stage between capitalism and socialism, you're basically going to have state capitalism. You have capitalism, the government is going to lay out these central plans and take control of certain industries within capitalism to help it transition to socialism. That's the quickest explanation I can give you now. I recommend you check out that video, Is China Marxist? By Midwestern Marx on YouTube, or read Roland Bohr's Has China Restored Capitalism? Or Has Capitalism Been Restored in China? Roland Bohr, it's spelled Rolandboer, I believe. We're actually having him on the show for an interview soon, although first we're going to talk to him about theology, and then we will talk to him about China later on. So I wanted to stop and cover this question because it's, very obvious question that's on the minds of any Western leftist who's not super familiar with China or who hasn't studied China deeply. So not a dumb question at all. And one that I wanted to cover before we jump into this video, because this video will be focused on the nitty gritty more so than a broad narrative about is China socialist or capitalist.
Am I far enough away? They were all looking at a neighbourhood of 15 high-rise buildings, 30 stories high.
15 towers unfinished for 7
This next part is sick, I can't lie.
years. The developer bankrupt.
On radios across the area, a countdown started. 4.8 tons of explosives detonated. Like candlesticks that had just had a tablecloth pulled out from underneath them, they toppled over sideways, into, onto, and around each other.
Isn't that crazy?
It's not something you see every day. And yet,
It's not an isolated case. Across China, the building boom that powered the economic miracle is running out of steam.
across China,
You hear that? China's economy is running out of steam. Look, they're getting rid of houses that nobody's living in to make room for other forms of economic development. Surely this means that their economy is running out of steam. Either way, regardless of whether you agree with that running out of steam line or not, which I do not, this was awesome to watch. It's crazy to watch the buildings fall in on themselves like that. That's how Bush did 9/11. Just kidding. Allegedly. Don't take me off YouTube. I'm not a conspiracist. Leave me alone.
more than 20% of apartments are vacant. The apartments are either unwanted or have been bought by middle-class Chinese investors as a safe place to put their money. But their money is not safe. Property prices are going down. Property developers are going down.
Property prices are going down? No! The Chinese people will actually be able to afford houses, unlike Americans. But who will think of the speculators? Who will think of the housing developers? Houses are for living in, not for speculation. Xi Jinping.
Bankrupt by the
Housing prices going down in China is a good thing for people who need me to spell it out for them, because that means houses are cheaper. Whereas in the US, housing prices are skyrocketing and almost everybody has to rent nowadays.
massive debt they accrued to build these apartments. The population is going down. The birth rate's going down, meaning there's no one to live in these apartments, which is why... Now, China's situation...
Does that not make sense to demolish them? I mean, if nobody's living in them, doesn't it make sense to demolish them so you can make room for other stuff? In the US, we have more empty houses than we have, or we have more homeless people than we we have more empty houses than we have homeless people. Right? So we've got all these vacant houses and all these people living on the streets, but we won't allow people to live in those because housing prices and the cost of rent are too high. Because in the US, we prioritize housing developers and housing speculators and landlords. In China, they prioritize people and their ability to have shelter, to have a home. You know, so if there's unused houses, they're going to get rid of them and put something else there. In the US, we don't worry about that. We don't worry if, people are housed. We don't worry if people are living on the streets. We just worry about the bottom line of real estate developers and landlords.
Isn't unique. Similar things have happened in their neighbouring countries due to lots of different factors. But in China, it's happening really fast. The question is, what makes China different? Well, in a way, it's for the same reason most Chinese people my age have no brothers or sisters. China's one-child policy is over. And now it's starting to cost China a lot. I'm Matt Bevan, and this is If You're Listening.
It's so dramatic, yet it's so well produced, and it kind of makes me jealous. I have some lights. That guy's got a lot of lights behind him. I have to set up my strip lights and try and increase our production value around here. I'm never going to be able to be that dramatic when I talk, though. And I'm never going to be able to talk out of my ass this much. China's economy crashing. Let's see it. Let's see it, hipster Kyle Kalinske.
1979, an unusual group of people was sitting around a table in Beijing. A Zimbabwean activist, two famous novelists, the deputy director of the British Museum, the paramount leader of China, Deng Xiaoping,
Round of applause for the architect of modern China, Deng Xiaoping.
and David Attenborough,
Truly astonishing.
the nature documentary guy.
Remarkable piece of deception.
As in, that David Attenborough.
Whoops.
That same year, Attenborough had launched his landmark show Life on Earth, basically the kind of doco he's now known for making. It took 3 years to make and sent him all over the world. But one country he struggled to visit was China. Not many foreigners were allowed in it.
Krana Ursa says, wasn't the one-child policy brought to China by the West? I've heard that, and I mean, there's a lot. I was reading some articles about it today. I mean, it's more complicated than that to say the U.S. just forced the one-child policy on China, but China did go through this reform and opening up period, and that also meant not just opening up to markets, but they were opening up to a lot of ideas. Like they allowed Milton Friedman to come in and talk in China. And they were like, wow, that guy's extremely dogmatic. And they ended up telling him maybe China's economic model will work better than the U.S. economic model, which is hilarious because that's proven to be true. But they were opening up to a lot of different ideas, and obviously Malthusian or neo-Malthusian economics in the U.S. are very, very big, trying to look at economic trends versus population and the growth rate of the population and draw a correlation between the two. Marx obviously went into great detail in Capital Volume 1, criticizing Malthus and showing his analysis of the famine in India failed to take into account capitalism and the inefficiencies and contradictions of capitalism, which actually created the famine. And instead, he just blamed it on the large population size of India, while never actually drawing a statistical correlation between the two. It's just easy to say, right? It sounds right. Oh, the population's growing. We're going to run out of food to feed those people, and that's why they're going to die. It's not because the British are hoarding food and bringing it to feed themselves and depriving the Indian people who they're exploiting as a colony. So neo-Malthusian economics are big in the U.S. And, you know, we see it with China. They're constantly looking at China's changing demographics and saying, look, their economy is going to collapse. Meanwhile, you know, they never show any economic data or economic trends to back up their argument that China's economy is inevitably going to collapse. All they use is population data. This is neo-Malthusianism. Drawing a correlation between population, economics, and then ignoring all the other factors, or most of the other factors. So in the 70s and 80s, based on the limited research I was able to do for this, it seemed like a lot of neo-Malthusian Western academics were pushing their ideas on China, saying your population is too big, your productive forces aren't advanced enough, you know, you need to put a halt on population, you need to do something about population. Even David Attenborough is going to ask Deng Xiaoping, what are you going to do about the population? You know, so it was largely a neo-Malthusian idea in the West that they were pushing, which maybe some of the Chinese academics and leaders accepted a little bit, that China needed to slow down their population and allow their productive forces to catch up. Now, is that the case, or is it just the case that China's economic planners and their leadership said, well, our productive forces aren't that advanced. We're a semi-feudal country. We're not industrialized, and we have this giant population and all these mouths to feed. We should slow down the population a little bit and allow our productive forces to catch up. Maybe that's the case. In reality, it's probably a mixture of the two, right? There probably were real reasons for the one-child policy, and it was probably partly due to the influence of neo-Malthusian Western academics telling China that they needed to put a halt on their population in order to survive. Either way, one-child policy is not around anymore, and China's got the fastest growing economy on earth.
Time.
The Chinese seem to prefer to receive small groups with some definite purpose, which would benefit China as well as the visitor. They've shown no interest in receiving tourists.
One of the only ways to go there was to join a delegation. So, as a distinguished British person, he did. He and the others got to tour Beijing and sit down with the guy running the entire country in a televised chat. David Attenborough, ever the environment.
Running the entire country. I missed that the first time I watched this. I mean, I guess that's fair to say of Deng that he was running the entire country because he was the leader of the country, but it's a country of over 1 billion people. It can't just be run by one guy. But
environmentalist had a burning question for Deng, one he had never been asked by Western media before. He asked what China was planning to do about population growth. Deng said, at present, we are encouraging...
So you see, David Attenborough asked him what they're going to do about population growth. So clearly in the Western world, this was a thing, right? This idea that China's population is enormous, Their productive forces aren't that well advanced. What are they going to do about, exponential growth of their population? So it was, an idea in the West that possibly they, push towards China.
Married couples to have only one child, and material awards are given to those couples who only have one child.
So I think that kind of shows, the response that Dan gave to David Attenborough, that the China's one-child policy wasn't as draconian as it was portrayed as in the West, right? In the West, they say in China you couldn't have two children. If you did, one of the children was killed by the state and the communists, or they would leave it to die, and they would monitor people, and people had to hide their children from the state. But in reality, it was just the government providing material incentives for Chinese citizens to only have one child, and then expanding access to contraceptives, expanding access to birth control and education about birth control, as well as just, expanding access to education in general for women in general, and providing, IUDs and providing birth control. And, religious minorities like the Uyghur population were exempt from the one-child policy because of their religious beliefs. These are the Uyghurs that the U.S. now says China is supposedly doing a genocide against. So they allowed them to be exempted from the one-child policy because of their religious views. So the sort of draconian picture, authoritarian picture of the one-child policy that we get in the West isn't entirely accurate.
Who only have one child. Just as an aside, I found this out by digging through an old transcript. I don't think anyone realizes that it was David Attenborough who scored one of the journalistic coups of the decade, confirmation that China had introduced the one-child policy.
Goodbye.
So what is the one?
I should have looked this up. Does anyone know? Does China call it the one-child policy, or is that a name that the West gave it? The West looked at China's birth control policies and said it was the one-child policy so they could portray it as this sort of draconian thing enforced from the top down.
Child policy. Why was it put in place? Well, in 1970, the average Chinese woman gave birth 6 times in her life. Child mortality was 10%, which is, of course, tragic. But it meant that most Chinese families had 5 or 6 kids. Chinese authorities saw this as a big, big problem. So they asked one of their most brilliant citizens to look at it, Song Jian. Song Jian had a reputation as a genius whose mind could be directed at any problem and solve it quickly. But he was...
You think they had one guy? You think this country of 1 billion people had one guy working on the population problem, or trying to figure out how the population would affect the economy? Like, this just shows that the West has no idea how things even work in China. Right? And this is why I'm always telling people to read the debate within the Communist Party, read what the different Chinese scholars and Chinese communists are saying to each other, because it's not just one person, doing this analysis and making their economic policies. These are made collectively by groups of experts and by groups of economists, and with information given to them by party cadres who are in charge of each area. So every geographical area of China has a party cadre in charge of it, who reports back to the party and reports back to the central committee, so they can then make economic decisions based on the needs of the people in each geographic region. But you expect us to believe that China was like, we're wondering if we've got a problem with our population here. Let's just call up one guy and completely base all of our economic policy for the next 50 years off of what this one guy tells us. And you expect us to believe that's what that's what's leading to the inevitable collapse of China that you guys have predicted like 20 times in the past decade. Like, come on. Use some critical thinking here, hipster Kyle Kulinski.
Wasn't a demographer. He was a rocket scientist. The government asked him to look at the population problem. Working on it.
So they didn't even have demographers. They had one rocket scientist who they brought in to do all of the work related to the economy and the population. Does that sound like it's real? Does that sound like it's real? Ask yourself, when you hear propaganda like this, does that sound like something an actual country would do?
In his spare time, he predicted that the country's population would hit 4 billion in a century. Now, Song Jian might have been great at predicting the trajectory of missiles, but this trajectory was way off. He ignored the fact that throughout
They actually had Jimmy Neutron. Jimmy Neutron determined what China's population policy should be, but he got it wrong, and now they're going to collapse inevitably. Just trust me.
the 1970s, Chinese fertility plunged from 6 kids per woman to 2.5 kids per woman, thanks to access to family planning and better education. That's what happens literally everywhere in the world. If you send girls to school and give them access to contraception and abortions, they will have fewer kids. But Chinese authorities saw Songjian's scary charts and implemented the one-child policy.
The greatest single threat to Chinese progress and development is people. There are millions too many, hundreds of millions too many.
The one-child policy was about increasing...
That's such a Malthusian idea that the number one obstacle to their development is people. Like, clearly that's not true because China's been the fastest growing economy on Earth for like 70 years. But part of the reason they've been able to do that is because of their giant labor force, because of their people, because of the amount of people they have contributing to their society and contributing to production.
Productivity. I have 4 kids, and it affects my productivity a bit. The Chinese Communist Party wanted to see what would happen if everyone only had 1 kid.
We have to strongly advocate one child, one couple.
They didn't mess about. They wrote it into the country's constitution. They only allowed couples to marry after they turned 26.
In a nation of 1,000 million, the state decides when people can be married. This couple have promised the state they'll have only 1 child. That will be their contribution to population control.
And, it being the Chinese Communist Party, they monitored people to make sure that they didn't break the rules.
The penalties for having too many children, especially in the towns, can be severe. Work permits are withheld, and housing space becomes more difficult.
In each city neighbourhood, they set up a family planning clinic.
The state keeps records of the breeding potential and performance of all residents. Who's been sterilized? Who's taking the pill? Who's signed the promise to have no more children?
And this is something that you would think Western liberals would praise, right? Setting up birth control clinics in rural areas and all over China, you know, but when they're using it to talk about China, they don't call it birth control, they call it sterilization. And they don't call it, you know, family planning centers in different areas. Or maybe they do, but they say it was draconianly forced upon them by the government. It's not that they increased education of women and access to contraceptives and birth control education naturally as their society progressed and as their productive forces increased. Couldn't be that. It was that the government forced them all to be sterilized.
A government official proudly boasted.
And what's interesting, too, is a lot of Western academics nowadays do actually praise the one-child policy. They say that the fetter that was put on the population growth in China not only had positive effects for China's economy, but for the world economy. Now, I don't know about that. That might just be the neo-Malthusianism speaking. But, yeah, there's a lot of Western academics who praise it.
So that the party had prevented the birth of 400 million people. In rural areas, people were sterilised against their will. In 1983 alone, authorities performed more than 20 million sterilizations and 15 million abortions. Children born in the
Sterilization is always the word they use too. Forced sterilizations are what the Falun Gong always says that China is doing to the Uyghurs, even though their population is growing faster than ever. They use the word sterilization. They don't say, you know, the government provided material incentives for women who got their tubes tied after they had 1 child, or material incentives for women who got IUDs, which is what really was happening. You know, they were saying if you have 1 child and then you get what's a very common procedure in America, you know, vasectomies or getting your tubes tied. Vasectomies for men, tubes tied for women. I don't know what that procedure is actually called, or getting an IUD. You know, the government was providing that for free and encouraging people to get those because of the policy. But they just say sterilization because that sounds bad. It sounds like the government's going in and, you know, performing forced surgeries on people to sterilize them. But
1980s and 1990s in China became the first generation of only children.
The Chinese call them Xiao Wendi. That means little emperors, a pejorative label for only children.
The population began to...
I'm actually so glad I'm not an only child. I'm so glad I have a brother and sister. It just it affects you positively. No offense to the only children out there. Not to say you can't be a good only child.
You wildly male, as people avoided their only child being a girl with abortion, abandonment, or straight up murder.
These only children grow up without the tempering influence of brothers and sisters.
There are now millions of Chinese bachelors going to great lengths to make themselves more appealing to women. This phenomenon has actually driven up property prices, as owning an apartment is seen as a prerequisite for marriage. The one-child policy may have worked, but it was wildly unpopular. And by 2010, the Chinese Communist Party realised that it had worked a little bit too well. Their family planning policies had started a timer. They had a generation of workers unencumbered by lots of kids. But soon enough, their parents were going to retire, and they'd be back to square one. The working population would have too many old people to look after and not enough young people to work. Australian economist Ross Garnaut put it like this.
The big question that worries a lot of people in China is, will China get old before it gets rich?
You can't control...
They're showing a whole lot of Western economists talking about China. A whole lot of Australian economists talking about China. How about some Chinese economists? How about, two Chinese economists with slightly different opinions on the one-child policy? No. We just want to hear Westerners talking about China. Why would we listen to the debate going on in China? Who would know China better than some guy in Australia?
How many old people you have? Well, I don't know if I can't, but you definitely shouldn't. But the Chinese Communist Party began to ask, when should we let people start having more than one kid again? To answer that question, they would need really, really good data on how big the population was getting. No problem. That's what censuses are for, right?
The census will tell the Chinese government just how many people they have to look after, what social and political programs to develop, where to spend money, and where not to spend money.
But for a million different reasons, the authoritarian Chinese government incentivizes lying. Are you an official who wants more government funding sent to your area or a higher salary? Just invent a few people in your region and watch the money roll in.
So, this is so funny. The Chinese Communist Party is authoritarian. They monitor their people's every move. If you sneeze wrong in China, they throw you in a work camp. They're so authoritarian and draconian, it's a complete security state. But then, they also say China counted their people wrong, and it was super, super easy to lie to the government, and these people taking the census just lied so they could scam the government for more money. And then China thought, he's going to say China thought they had more people than they actually did, and that's why their economy is about to collapse. Trust me, bro. Right? So are they super authoritarian, and do they monitor their people's every move? Or are they incompetent and unable to even count their population? Which one is it?
You want more than one kid? Just have two, but don't tell anyone.
The parents, fearing the authorities, had simply kept the children at home and not informed the government.
What about if your grandpa dies, but you want to keep collecting his pension? Or just don't tell the government that he's dead.
Dude, people do that with Social Security all the time. That's Social Security fraud. Don't tell people that your grandpa's dead and then just collect his checks. That's not exclusive to China. Oh my goodness, look at his face here. Looks like he's being possessed by a demon.
Keep cashing the checks. Easy. Are you a family planning official trying to justify continuing the one-child policy you championed? Or just twiddle with a few metrics and watch the numbers go up. Thanks for all this meddling, some experts like Professor Yi Fuxian think the government was overestimating their population by 10%, creating more than 100 million imaginary people, mostly young imaginary people. In 2013, the new Chinese President Xi Jinping started to unwind the policy.
But under a new rule, couples will be allowed to have a second child if either parent has grown up as an only child.
Then everyone was allowed to have a second child. But there was a problem with that.
Maybe after 5 or 3 years, we can consider about that. But from now on, I think the only one child is enough for us.
The millennials were the best educated, most fawned over Chinese generation ever. And they wanted to raise their kids as little emperors too. Professor Yi Fuxian said people didn't want more kids. And even if they did, they now couldn't afford it.
If I have a second child, this apartment will be too small. We'll need to move somewhere bigger.
A top family planning official had projected that dropping the policy would lead people to start having 4-child families again. Problem solved. But people did not start having 4 kids.
When the one-child law was finally abolished, China experienced a small jump in the birth rate in 2016, but that was followed by a drop the
By the way, Yi Fuxian, the guy they're basing all their data on for this or all their analysis, is one of these guys who's written a book about how China is going to collapse because of their population. So another one of these Malthusian sort of thinkers who's just trying to write a book about the collapse of China and have it boosted by mainstream media and make some money. And his books have been banned in China since 2013 for being riddled with misinformation.
next year.
In fact, the birth rate continued to fall. Yi Fuxian had been right. In a panic, the Chinese government unbanned Yi Fuxian's book, cancelled his arrest warrant, and asked him to tour China talking about his findings. They hoped it would help convince people to have more kids, but it didn't. Things got worse. As recently as 2019, the UN projected that China's population would...
Oh, they did remove his ban. It looks like. Interesting.
continue growing and wouldn't peak until the 2030s. But they quickly realized that was wrong. In fact, it peaked in 2022. Yi Fuxian thinks it actually peaked back in 2018. Now, the population is shrinking, causing a shudder through the economy, which was expecting several more years of growth. So maybe you've been thinking, yes.
The other thing about these neo-Malthusian economists is they never actually give you any economic data, right? The shudder through China's economy, the collapse of China's economy, the decreasing productivity of their economy, the slowdown of their economy. He says all these things, but he never presents any economic data to prove that these things are true. All he does is say, this is what's going on with the population, and therefore it's having these negative effects on the economy. And when we go through the next article by John Ross explaining why China's economy isn't collapsing, you'll see it's the exact opposite. Basically, John Ross's entire article is economic data. It's him showing what the actual economic trends are in China, what their country's trending towards. What Malthusianism allows these sophists, or whatever you would want to call them, these propagandists, to do is just say population is doing this, therefore economy is inevitably going to do that. And they never have to actually tie the correlation together with statistics or economic data.
Yes, but when are you going to tell me what all this has to do with property and money and economic crises? Well, that'll be now. See, big property companies were building homes for the next generation of workers.
The Country Garden insists on the mode of fast development, fast sales, and carries out a positive management of high efficiency.
They've been borrowing hundreds of billions of dollars to build the apartments, confident that people in their 20s were about to leave home and buy them. The Chinese property industry is the biggest in the world. Fitch Ratings calls it the world's most important sector. It was a Ponzi scheme. It needed people to keep buying in and driving up prices, otherwise it wouldn't be able to pay off its debts. But the industry was building empty apartments for imaginary people. And cost of living pressures are hitting the non-imaginary ones. And now it's starting to crash. And this is having...
Do you see what they're doing there? It's total projection. They're saying that basically what happened with the 2008 financial crisis is going to happen in China. But what they don't realize, because Americans and Australians have no idea how China's actual economic system works, is that Chinese banks are state-owned. Right? Chinese banks aren't predatory. They're not like the American banks who are doing anything that they can to increase their profits and keep their bottom line high, and keep housing prices as high as they need to be, or sell enough houses, or give people enough housing loans and suck enough money out of people that way through them paying back loans with interest that you keep your bottom line high. And then, as the banks gave all these predatory loans to people to try and keep their profits high in 2008, eventually, the people taking loans from the bank to buy their housing couldn't pay back the loans with interest, and that's when the whole thing came crashing down, and we had the 2008 financial crisis. They're saying that's what's going to happen in China, but their banks are state-owned, right? Their banks aren't completely predatory. Their banks are designed to look out for what's in the interest of the entire economy, right? So they're not going to give these hyper-predatory loans the same way that Western banks did in order to keep their profits high. Right? Or they're not going to utilize debt in order to manipulate the market and consolidate their power and buy out other companies and bankrupt other companies. right? Because they're there to finance what the people need more so than being there to finance what makes them profit. So the entire structure of the Chinese financial system is different, which is why, Kyle Kulinski, in 2008, China had the only, after the crisis, they had the only economy on earth that had an increase, or that was still increasing. Their economy was still growing. The growth rate had been greatly slowed because the economic crash affected all the countries, and it affected all of China's trade partners. But their economy continued to grow during that time because they have all these central planning methods and all these nationalized parts of the financial sector and all these forms of economic central planning that were able to stabilize the economy and ensure that it didn't come crashing down like the capitalist economy. This shows the economic superiority of socialism. But now they're saying, eventually, just wait, the same thing's going to happen to China. But it's not. It's not. But will these guys ever apologize? Will they ever issue a retraction? Will they ever say we're wrong about China? No. No, they've been publishing these kind of articles and these kind of videos and these kind of books for years, saying that the inevitable collapse of China is on its way. They've never stopped doing it. Peter Zeihan has been doing it for 20 years now, and he has no shame. Continues to do it. Just recently did it on Joe Rogan, the largest podcast in America. They're shameless liars and propagandists. This guy's probably just a puppet for MSNBC, but whether he knows it or not, he's propagandizing the American people and pushing them towards a new Cold War or maybe even an eventual hot war with China. Hopefully not. But
An impact in Australia too. See, apartment buildings are built with steel, and steel is made from iron ore. So what does this mean for the country that makes its living selling iron ore to China? Well, that's why the ABC has a business news department.
So he basically is saying that Australia won't be able to sell China as much iron because they don't need as many residential houses anymore. So that doesn't really prove China's about to collapse, though, or China's on the verge of collapse. But theoretically, Marxism believes that societies are based on production, right? How we produce and reproduce our means of life. So most of the time we think about this in terms of labor, right? Humans labor, humans do activity to take nature and transform nature into what we need to survive, into our means of subsistence, right? This is production. Every society is based on production. But that's only one kind of production. There's also reproduction, meaning sexual reproduction, meaning the reproduction of human life, having babies, which is also necessary to continuing society, right? So in China, there's, and I mean, this is based on what I was reading, there's more of a precedent for making those kind of decisions collectively, right? Making decisions of reproduction as well as regular production based on what's needed for the whole of society and keeping the whole society going. Whereas in Western individualist liberal societies, of course, it's, no. If you stop somebody from having more than one child, that's an infringement on their human rights and on their individual rights. They should be able to have as many kids as they want with as many people as they want. That's freedom. So it also kind of shows the collectivist mindset versus the individualist mindset when it comes to reproduction. But not that I think people's, choices should be controlled in that realm. But if China did make the one-child policy because their productive forces hadn't yet advanced to the point where they could feed all the people who needed food, it makes sense that they would provide material incentives to try and keep the population from growing exponentially. Right? Allow our productive forces to develop, allow our agricultural production to develop. Once we can feed everybody, then we can get rid of these limits on reproduction. But reproduction is important from a Marxist perspective. That's the one thing I wanted to point out. It's not everything like the Malthusians say, but versus Malthusianism, as we explained in the video, they just say all of your economic success or failure is based on the size of your population and nothing else. And then they bring up no economic data, unlike the Marxists. I believe I don't know if John Ross calls himself a Marxist, but his analysis is essentially Marxist, who bring up a lot of economic data. So this is his article that we just published on MidwesternMarx.com. The news is full of headlines about China's economic collapse. Ignore them. So ignore the 15-minute video that we just debunked from ABC. It's a bunch of lies. Once again, the Western media establishment, and sadly some on the left, are talking up an impending economic disaster in China, when the truth is quite the opposite. In the last 4 years, covering the period of the COVID pandemic, China's economy has grown 2.5 times as fast as the US, 15 times as fast as France, 23 times as fast as Japan, 45 times as fast as Germany, and 480 times as fast as Britain. To add in smaller G7 countries, China has grown 4 times as fast as Canada and 11 times as fast as Italy. China's outperformance of advanced capitalist countries is even greater in per capita terms, a still better measure of productivity changes and potential for increasing living standards. China's per capita GDP grew 3 times as fast as the US, 5 times as fast as Italy, 44 times as fast as Japan or France, and 260 times as fast as Britain, while per capita GDP fell in Germany and Canada. China's outperformance of developing capitalist countries shows the same pattern. China's per capita 4.4% GDP annual average growth compares to 2.6% in India, 1.3% in Brazil, or 0.9% in South Africa. What is important about such economic growth, of course, is not abstract statistics, but its meaning for the real lives of ordinary people. Facts. The International Labor Organization data on real inflation-adjusted wages show that up to the latest available data for most countries in 2022 and for India in 2021, China's annual real wage growth was 4.7%. Their real annual wage growth, which I've actually seen Western economists take this and say that labor costs are increasing because they always give things from the perspective of the bourgeoisie, from the perspective of capitalists. So it's not wages, which is what it is from the perspective of the workers. They call it labor costs, and they say labor costs are increasing. Surely China's about to collapse is one of the things that Peter Zeihan says. Oh, you mean wages are increasing? That sounds like it's a good thing, Peter. For Britain, it was 0.1, the US 0.3, France 0.4, Germany minus 0.7, India minus 1.3%. Given this enormous economic outperformance of China, or by China, of capitalist countries, any rational discussion that should be taking place in Western mainstream media about the international economic situation would be, why is China's economy hugely outperforming the US and the rest of the capitalist West? And what lessons are to be learned from China's socialist economy that is outperforming us so? For the left, the issue needs to be assessed and publicized the issue that does need to be assessed and publicized is, why are real wages raising 18 times faster in China than the US and 44 times faster than Britain, while real wages are falling in other advanced capitalist countries? Indeed, the present author would argue that a much greater stress should be placed on the latter point. The international left has begun to absorb that China has lifted more than 850 million people out of poverty. In 40 years, by far the greatest poverty reduction achievement in human history, but it has not yet internalized how rapidly not only the poorest but average living standards are rising in China, far faster than in any Western country. But of course, this real economic situation can't be discussed in the mainstream media because its conclusions would be too damaging for the capitalist West. Instead, a type of mad discussion is unfolding, with U.S. claims about China's economy becoming increasingly bizarre. One might say deranged as they get further and further out of touch with reality. Kind of like the video that we just watched, bringing up no economic data, just bringing up some population statistics and saying that because of the one-child policy, the so-called one-child policy 50 years ago, China is now going to inevitably collapse. Totally deranged, totally out of touch with reality, totally just wishful thinking on behalf of the capitalist West and the propagandists. President Joe Biden, for example, recently made a speech claiming China's economic growth rate is around 2%, when it was 5.5% in the first half of this year. And as already noted, China's economy is growing 2.5 times as fast as the US. Biden bizarrely claimed that in China, the number of people who are of retirement age is larger than the number of people of working age, which is such a ridiculous thing to even say. But it's entirely false and an inaccurate figure, or inaccurate by a figure of many hundreds of millions of people. So they're just literally pulling these population statistics out of their ass to try and explain away the unbelievable economic growth in China and the poverty alleviation programs in China. Discussion in the US financial media equally refuses to face real facts. Because I am an economist, every morning after the overall news, I switch on Bloomberg TV to catch up on the latest economic data. Discussion there is like Alice Through the Looking Glass. The book, the principle of which is that everything is reversed compared to the real world. Exactly. It's a topsy-turvy, upside-down world. I like that analysis of Through the Looking Glass. Apparently, according to Bloomberg's analysis, China's annual average of 4.5% a year growth in the last 4 years is an economy in severe crisis, whereas the US's 1.8% is allegedly strong. Not to speak of Britain's 0.1. Similar rhetoric, out of all contact with factual reality, pervades the Financial Times, The Economist, or the Wall Street Journal, of course. The left is used to such U.S. political lying. The completely fake claim that the North Vietnamese ships attacked U.S. naval vessels on August 4th in the Gulf of Tonkin used to launch the Vietnam War. The equally untrue claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction to justify the U.S. invasion were classic examples. Great, because we know, of these famous cases of the U.S. media lying, but we don't realize how they lied to us about, say, economic data, or how they lied to us about countries like China on a daily basis, right? Almost every so-called leftist or socialist, or even a lot of non-politically, a lot of people who don't have their nose in politics every day know that the U.S. lied us into the Iraq War, right? But a lot of them don't realize that the media is still lying to us on a daily basis, even about smaller things or things that seem to be less important. Today, the U.S. systematically lies about the state of China and its own economy because it is crucial for U.S. capitalism to prevent its own citizens and close allies from understanding the real economic trends. Yes, if people understood what China was doing, they would demand tomorrow that our country start moving towards an economic model more similar to China's, an economic model that invests in production, invests in infrastructure, invests in the people, and raising the American working class out of poverty and increasing their living standards. It's further proof, if one were needed, of the truth that if the real world and a theory do not coincide, only one of two things can be done. One is abandon the theory, the other is to abandon the real world. Oh, that's so good. And these guys really can't abandon this theory that China's about to collapse. Even though the real world keeps telling them their theory is wrong, they keep beating the American public over the head with this idea. In this case, the theory is that the U.S., because it is capitalist, should outperform socialist China. They should. In the minds of these neoclassical economists, they should, so therefore we'll just say that they are. The real world is actual economic performance in which China continues to outperform the U.S. and other capitalist countries by an enormous margin. Unable to abandon its theory, the U.S. is therefore forced to abandon the real world, hence the demented denial of the comparative economic performance noted at the beginning of this article. While the left should expect lies from capitalism, what is rather shameful is that some sections of the left repeat such nonsense, apparently believing that if they put a few left phrases into an analysis taken from the Western press, this constitutes socialist commentary. For example, an article in the New Left Review sidecar called China, a Zombie Economy. Some zombie when China's economy is growing anywhere between 2.5 times and 480 times as fast as any major capitalist economy. No kidding. The real data shows that the reality is simple. China has far outgrown any Western capitalist economy for more than 40 years, and it continues to do so. The result in China is by far the world's most rapid rise in living standards, not only for the poorest, but for the whole average population. It is known as the practical advantage of socialism. It is fact. We know why the U.S. has to make up big lies about it. There is no justification for sections of the left echoing them. Absolutely. Absolutely. Those Vaushites of the world, the leftists, the so-called socialists who are condemning China and condemning China's poverty alleviation and parroting State Department talking points about China. Pull your head out of your butt. Stop making yourself a tool. Start reading articles like this and stop watching articles like that ABC News clip that we just played. You know why the ABC News clip and Peter Zeihan and all these goofballs in the Western press predicting that China's collapse is inevitable? You know why they don't cite any economic data? Because if they did, as John Ross showed here, if they brought up any of this economic data, it would destroy their argument. People would see, oh, wow, China's economy is actually growing much faster than ours. Their people are retiring much sooner because they're more prosperous and they're actually able to. They have much less poverty, far less homelessness. They have public transportation and all these other amenities that we don't have in the US. Their economy is far outperforming ours, but they don't want to do that. They just want to claim that China is inevitably going to collapse. So the one data point that they use is population size. And this is what Malthusianism allows them to do, is explain away what's actually going on with China's real economy. Just ignore everything that's going on with China's economic growth and say, well, it's all going to collapse soon because of their population, right? We're not going to explain the correlation between economic collapse or economic downturns and population. We're just going to say that a collapse is inevitable and leave it at that. And that's what the Malthusian ideology allows bourgeois propagandists to do. And that's why Malthusianism and neo-Malthusianism is being embraced more and more by the American ruling class, and why it needs to be combated by us Marxists, right? Be aware of this Malthusian ideology, this ideology that says the population's growing too fast. It's growing too fast. We have to shut down the farms. We have to not produce. We have to have less people, less people, less people. That is Malthusianism. We don't need less people. We need more control of production. We need less capital.